If you are old enough to remember the release of the Sega Dreamcast, then you will more than likely remember what an impressive piece of hardware it was. Not only was this the most powerful game console that the world had ever seen, but the graphics present in many of its games were a completely different level to anything else we could experience in the homes. The Dreamcast was the system that had not only caught up with what could be found in arcades, but often the system's ports topped their arcade counterparts. Take Soul Calibur for example, which included both improved graphical elements and more gameplay features. The Dreamcast was the real deal. So with that said, join me today as we take a trip back through time and re-experience this wonderful console's life cycle, discuss some of the games, and look at why the platform sadly didn't sell quite as well as it perhaps should have. So without further ado, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is why you need a Sega Dreamcast. Yeah! Experiencing the launch of a Sega Dreamcast in real time is one of those gaming moments that you tend to never forget. After all, this was a piece of hardware that was so ahead of its time, often you would power on games and not quite believe what you were seeing. This was an era when the term next generation game console still held gravitas, and the leap we saw between games of a Sega Dreamcast and those that were present on the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation was a very visible generational gap. As for my first experience with the Sega Dreamcast, it was in my next door neighbour's house. My 15-year-old friend had been working hard in the corner shop on our street, toiling away illegally working for £2.50 an hour. The London schoolboy's hard work would be enough to allow him to buy the new Dreamcast at launch, which would mean I too would get to experience a slice of gaming's future. The likes of Sonic Adventure with its insanely good graphics was a sight to behold, with Sonic being represented like he had never been before. But of course the games were only just the start, as you could browse the damn internet using this thing, an option that felt like an entire new world was being opened up before our eyes. Using Dreamcast Online, we would claim his free copy of Choo Choo Rocket, which after a few days felt like it magically turned up at his door. Typing in a few details on a game console to then have a game posted through his letterbox felt like witchcraft. Like this couldn't possibly be real. To make matters all the more surreal, we discovered chat rooms, a feature that allowed us to speak to other people in real time from the comfort of our living room. To be honest, our primitive teenage minds couldn't think of anything meaningful to discuss with others, so we just chose to try and wind people up instead. Much like when we would choose to prank call random phone numbers regularly. Little did we know at the time, but we were taking part in an act of internet trolling, a practice that even your nan is likely to be familiar with at this point. But it was new territory for us through the magic of a Dreamcast. Through all of this, I knew I had to have a Dreamcast to call my own, but more on how I got my own later. For now, let's look at how this amazing system came into existence in the first place. Although they were still one of the biggest and most recognisable names in the industry by the time the late 90s came around, Sega's influence had dwindled significantly, and their position at the upper echelon of gaming didn't seem quite so set in stone as it once did. Another entry in the extremely volatile and incredibly competitive and difficult to gauge console market could quite literally make or break the beloved Sega at this point. So they had to be well aware that any repeats of the kind of costly mistakes and balmy decision making that they had been so guilty of in recent years could prove lethal to them. So a well thought out plan would be required if they stood any chance of surviving in the hardware market. But the big question going into this was, had they already done an insurmountable amount of damage that would seal the fate of their new system before it was even released? That was a genuine concern. So how had Sega found themselves in this mess? Sega laid some necessary foundations for the future during the 8-bit era, but ultimately failed in North America with their Master System. It was their entry into the 4th generation of consoles, the Genesis, that really cracked the US market open for them, bringing them mainstream recognition and all new levels of brand loyalty. Genesis did what Nintendo didn't. The next few consoles and add-ons, however, were far less fortuitous for them, with each effort proving to be a financial drain. By the time Sega's 32-bit CD-based powerhouse, the Saturn, was discontinued on American soil in mid-1998, the once highly respected Japanese gaming company had essentially produced 3 massive flops in a row, with the Sega CD, the Sega 32X, and the Saturn all failing to reach anything like the success they had been expected and predicted by both the public, the press, and Sega themselves. This period also marked the first time in over 12 years that Sega didn't have an active console on the home gaming market. Although the Saturn actually performed relatively well domestically in Japan, continuing to be produced and sold for quite some time after it was discontinued elsewhere, with a much richer and more varied library of games, the console's life in the States and in PAL regions was worryingly short. As far as Western consumers were concerned, there was no sugarcoating it. All 3 systems were huge disappointments, and the level of brand loyalty and consumer satisfaction that they had managed to build up over their most prosperous period, during the late 80s and early 90s, was at an all-time low. Relationships with third-party developers had also suffered after the shaky 32X and awkward to program for Saturn hardware had given many calls to drop off from projects and distance themselves from the company. Any new consoles from Sega beyond this point would be met with inevitable doubt and skepticism from media and consumers alike, which meant that their next piece of hardware would seriously have its work cut out for it. Following several years of dwindling sales and declining profits, in 1998 Sega reported its first consolidated losses for a fiscal year since the company was very first listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange in 1988. It was a troubling time indeed, with some reports estimating that Sega would have lost over $1 billion during the Saturn's brief yet costly life. To say launching a new console in these circumstances was risky would be a massive understatement, but given how far along Sega already were in the development of an all-new next-generation system at this point, the decision to continue with the project was made for them, despite the fact that another failure could cause the company irreparable damage. A Saturn follow-up had actually been discussed from as early as 1995, with conflicting reports suggesting Sega were either in the process of developing a Saturn II or a 64-bit add-on for the original console, but plans were scrapped before anything really got off the ground. It wasn't until 1997 when Sega of America's CEO Irimajiri decided it would be in the company's best interests to look outside of internal development for the processing power of their next system that things started to get going and headway started to be made. Incidentally, Irimajiri was the man that replaced Tom Kalinske as head honcho of Sega's American branch. The services of IBM's Tatsuo Yamamoto were enlisted by Irimajiri to head a team of devs working on a secret project known only at the time as Black Belt. Sega of America had partnered with highly respected electronics company 3DFX to use their accelerated 3D Voodoo processors on the new hardware, partnered with a Motorola Power PC600. But at the same time that all of this was going on, Sega of Japan had commissioned a team led by console king Hideki Sato to design a system using entirely different chips and processors for reasons that have never really been made fully clear. Sato's crew of tech cronies were using the new Hitachi SH4 processor, which was something of a follow-up to the one found in the Saturn, as well as the VideoLogic Power VR2 to soup up the graphics. This project was initially named White Belt, but was later changed to Dural, named after the Virtua Fighter antagonist. It seems pretty crazy that 2 branches of the same company were working against each other, essentially competing with themselves for the rights to have the say on the new hardware's innards. But this is Sega we're talking about here. All the criticism that the troubled gaming giants took about the Saturn's awkward and difficult to design for hardware seems to have really been taken on board by Sega, as they had entered into yet another partnership, this time with the mighty Microsoft, to oversee the development of both branches' respective consoles, with an eye on making sure that the forthcoming system would be as developer friendly as possible. Both versions of the new, as yet unnamed consoles got fairly far along into development, but in a move that will surprise absolutely no one that knows anything about 90s Sega, Sega of Japan did the dirty on their American colleagues and made the decision to go with their boy Hideki Sato and his SH4 driven device. It has been speculated that this was due to the political connections between the Japanese offices and Japanese company NEC, who are responsible for the Power VR2 chip found in the Dural, but who knows what actually went on. This would obviously end up upsetting the nice folks over at Sega America to no end, who had numerous staff walkouts after the announcement was made, that all their hard work was essentially being flushed down the lavatory of gaming history. They weren't as upset as the 3DFX company, however, who responded by suing both Sega and NEC for breach of contract. This rather costly matter was settled out of court, but it proved a huge financial drain for Sega at a time when they could scarcely afford such things. In early 1998, with the decision to go with the Japanese branch's version of the system set in stone, Sega abandoned the dual moniker and renamed their new console Katana, although this was still seen as a placeholder name. They announced that the system would be ready for Christmas of that year and would ship out to stores in time for the holiday season. In May, new Sega president Irimajiri unveiled the Dreamcast, its full specs and some swanky looking tech demos at a press event called Sega New Challenge Conference, giving the world its first glimpse of their revolutionary new device. A short 6 days later, at the 1998 E3, wild-eyed madman and Sega America Vice President Bernie Stolar unveiled the system to the Western world, with an expected release of somewhere in autumn of 1999. Quite the elongated period of gestation, if I do say so myself. The wait though was made all the more tantalising when we saw just how powerful and technologically advanced the Dreamcast was going to be. This little bit of kit was set to absolutely put all other dedicated gaming systems that came before it to shame. There was simply nothing that came even remotely close to matching the Dreamcast's graphical processing power, or potential for technically impressive games anywhere else on the market. There were initial plans to leave Sega's name off of the final design of the system and its branding completely, due to fears that the negative association that came with the Sega logo after the failure of the Saturn would tarnish their new console and potentially hinder its success. The idea was that Dreamcast would eventually become its own brand, similar to how the term PlayStation had worked for Sony, but this notion was eventually dropped. Being released to Japan on November the 27th at a price of 29,000 yen, the console's design and display options were massively forward thinking, with a Dreamcast capable of outputting via S-Video, composite or RBG at either 240p or 480i. And the system having a built-in 4 controller ports on the front, making multiplayer games a clear priority. Astonishingly, the Dreamcast could even output certain compatible games at 480p, provided you had a VGA adapter handy, which was unheard of at the time and was bordering on some Martin McFly level time travel skullduggery. Similarly, as discussed earlier when highlighting my early personal experience, internet connectivity was possible, with an included modem straight out of the box, although interestingly this was scrapped on later models. With the Dreamcast, Sega were keen to avoid using the CD-ROM format, which had become prone to piracy in recent years, so instead opted to use the new Gigabyte disc, or GD-ROM, which was developed in conjunction with Yamaha. Ironically, this supposedly piracy-proof medium ended up being one of the Dreamcast's biggest downfalls, as it wasn't long before the internet figured out exactly how to make copied Dreamcast games, both extremely easily and extremely cheaply, making Sega's new system one of the easiest to play pirated games on of all time. To compound problems further, the console's Japanese launch came with a rather meagre 4 games on release, including Godzilla Generations, July, Pen Pan Triathlon, and Virtua Fighter 3 TB, which was very much a system seller, and the only really noteworthy title amongst the initial selection. Much like with the release of a Saturn just a few years earlier, almost every one of the 350,000 consumers that purchased the Dreamcast on launch day also bought a copy of Virtua Fighter. With a rumoured sequel to Sony PlayStation on the horizon, Sega were eager to get as much of a head start as possible and build a large install base in Japan, but unforeseen chip shortages meant that supply could not meet demand, and supposedly an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 extra units of the system could have been sold during its first month, had Sega been able to produce the consoles in time. Over in America, Sega and Big Bad Bernie Stolar were doing all they could to repair the damage done by the Saturn, making sure the Dreamcast would be sold in all relevant stores across the country, and repairing relationships with third-party developers. hype for the system was huge after word had got out about several quality games being released in Japan, such as Sonic Adventure and Sega Rally 2, and the mouth-watering announced price of $199. This meant consumers were chomping at the bit to get hold of Sega's impressive new console. Things were looking promising and everything seemed to be coming up Millhouse for Sega and the Dreamcast. Well, at least until March the 2nd of 1999, when Sony held a press conference to announce the PlayStation 2. This was the news Sega feared as Sony revealed their new system would boast an impressive 128-bit CPU with graphical prowess that could apparently outperform even high-end PCs. It had DVD playback and backwards compatibility with Sony's previous PlayStation console. Bully boy Sony had come and kicked sand in the Dreamcast's face, stole its lunch money and flushed the platform's head down the toilet for good measure. The Dreamcast had gone from being the most technically impressive console ever seen to being overshadowed by the demand of the PlayStation 2 in an instant. Its release stateside finally came on the 9th of September 1999, or 9999 as the rather convenient memorable slogan said, which was accompanied by the bizarre and often somewhat surreal It's Thinking advertising campaign, which seemed to confuse consumers as it wasn't really clear what Sega was selling, or what drugs they were taking when they came up with it. Just before the new kit was to be released in America, the shocking and sudden decision was made to fire Bernie Stolar and replace him with future head of EA Sports, Peter Moore, which must have been an extra kick in the teeth, given that it was Bernie that hired Moore in the first place. This placed Moore right in the hot seat for the big US launch, which actually ended up being the most successful launch of any home console ever at that point in time. A rare piece of good news in a story about Sega of America. A big factor in that success was the outstanding selection of games available. In contrast to the pitiful Japanese launch, American customers had a whopping 19 games to choose from, with highly desirable and several extremely fondly remembered titles amongst them, including but not limited to Power Stone, House of the Dead 2, Tokyo Extreme Racer, Sonic Adventure and Soul Calibur. What an excellent selection indeed. Sega couldn't ship consoles fast enough, and before 2 weeks they shifted an astonishing 500,000 units. For a brief fleeting moment in time, the Dreamcast was the biggest thing in entertainment, and Sega looked to be back to their winning ways, once again ruling the gaming roost in fact. By the end of 1999, Dreamcast sales were at around 1.5 million, but by January of 2000 the almost inevitable decline started worryingly rapidly, and those sales began dropping sharply. Things went from bad to worse after the Japanese launch of the Sony PS2 in March, which absolutely destroyed Dreamcast sales in that region, and all but made their new console a dead system in that market in Sega's eyes. Entering damage control mode, both Sega of America and Sega of Japan put all their collective efforts into keeping the Dreamcast alive on American soil, which included developing a robust and extremely impressive for the time online service for a selection of multiplayer games, and an expensive advertising campaign which culminated in the company having huge visibility at the MTV Video Music Awards. And yes, as unbelievable as it sounds, they used to play music videos on MTV. All this extra effort ultimately proved futile, as the system's failure in Japan, as well as the decline of the arcade market, had put massive amounts of financial strain on the company. Moore had stated that they would need to sell in excess of 5 million Dreamcast units by the end of the year 2000 to even have a hope of staying afloat, and they unfortunately fell short of that number by a good 2 million. It has been stated that it would have been possible for Sega to pour enough money into the Dreamcast to keep it alive longer, but that could potentially come at the risk of bankrupting the entire company. So on January the 31st, 2001, the regrettable, no sad, no absolutely tragic news that Sega were leaving the hardware market and taking our Dreamcast away from us was broken, and on March the 31st, the console was no more. A mere 18 months after the biggest and most successful launch in history, Sega's gamble didn't end up paying off, and their final console was discontinued. It really felt like Sega got things right with the Dreamcast by the time it came over to the West. It seemed like they learned from their mistakes and produced a progressive, cutting-edge piece of hardware that would restore all of the lost faith in the company. The truth is, aside from a few clumsy missteps, Sega did almost everything right, and the Dreamcast should have been a runaway success. Unfortunately, it was doomed the moment the PlayStation 2 with its DVD playback was announced. Despite essentially dying before its time, those who experienced the Dreamcast in its prime remember it very fondly indeed, with I personally being one of those people. Playing the Dreamcast was magical. As highlighted earlier in the video, I'd first get to play mine round a neighbour's house, but I was yet to have a Dreamcast to call my own. I would get my own as a gift for Christmas of the year 2000, which would end up contributing to some memorable Christmases indeed. So let me discuss with you some of the key games I played and how I experienced them. Sonic Adventure is obviously a big one for anyone who had a Dreamcast, and I was absolutely blown away with the game's graphics. They looked a different league to the likes of Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, but sadly, I felt the gameplay trailed well behind. The game offered some great blasts of fun, particularly when playing as Sonic, but the title lacked a true direction, and had too many flaws to be a true classic to me. But I will say, it was brilliant to see Sonic within such an amazing looking setting. Late into the system lifespan, I got Sonic Adventure 2 as well, which in my opinion at least felt like a step up from the previous offering, with more refined gameplay on display. But by far the Sonic stages, or the shadow ones that mirrored them, far outclassed those whereby you would control other characters. It felt like more emphasis was being placed on story and the series' strange new characters than it was on gameplay, which seems to me the wrong direction for the franchise. That should be mostly about quick platforming rather than anything else. So Sonic in 3D was cool, but should have been a lot better. Now, let me talk about with you games that not only impressed me, but had me rubbing my eyes, being not quite able to believe what I was witnessing. I'm of course talking about the Shenmue games. In fact, I distinctly remember playing the first one on the Christmas it came out, with my grandfather coming into the room being confused that he was looking at a video game. It certainly had no resemblance to Pac-Man or Space Invaders, that was for sure. The at the time most expensive game ever made delivered to me levels of immersion I'd never found in a game before, with everything in the title feeling more realistic than anything I'd seen in gaming previously, and for a long time after to be fair too. The world in the game felt very real, and wandering into the Game U arcade for the first time is something I will never forget. Going to an arcade to play a video game within a video game felt insane, with me falling in love with Space Harrier that Christmas too. The release of Shenmue is also the first instance I can recall personally of seeing 80s nostalgia celebrated, which is very weird for a 1999 game come to think about it. Shenmue is set in 1986, so it's the equivalent of creating a game today and getting all teary-eyed about 2009. No one seems to have nostalgia for that period. Where's my video game set in 2009? The following year, Shenmue 2 would amaze me once again, mainly as it offered all the same bells and whistles, only this time the world to explore was 3 times as massive. The game set in Hong Kong has also led me to become perpetually fascinated with the walled city of Kowloon, which was once the most densely populated spot in the world. Demolished back in 1987, makes exploring the walled city within the game feel all the more mysterious, in turn helping to lead to one of the most memorable gaming experiences that I've ever had. It's just such a crying shame that we had to wait so long for Shenmue 3, especially bearing in mind that it was all around terrible and brought no resolution to the story. It was Star Wars sequel level bad. Skies of Arcadia was also a pretty big deal on the system, a massive JRPG in which you could roam areas in a similar manner to that of Ocarina of Time. This was not the norm in JRPGs yet, as the famous ones like the Final Fantasy games on the PlayStation were restricted to including pre-rendered backdrops, like in Resident Evil. It's basically just a really solid role-playing game featuring turn-based battles to gain experience points, an overworld to explore using an airship, and 6 different regions in which the story takes place in. There are dungeons that must be explored and some really unique battle mechanics, particularly in relation to the game's airship battles. This is all paired with a great soundtrack that helps further immerse you in the game's world. It's a must-have, must-play title. Speaking of a Dreamcast library, the Power Stone games also brought unique gameplay to the table. These colourful arena fighters functioned as perfect chaotic party games that were fantastic to play with friends. The Dreamcast with its 4 controller slots in some ways felt like the spiritual successor to the Nintendo 64, in that this was the first new console since that one to come with built-in 4-player support. Something many of us had enjoyed and become accustomed to after the success of the likes of Mario Kart 64 and of course the legendary GoldenEye. This pair of Capcom games offered brilliant fun, presenting yet another reason to own a Dreamcast. As highlighted earlier in the video, another one that blew so many of our minds was the weapons-based fighter from Namco known as Soul Calibur. Like many titles on the Dreamcast, this game looked absolutely gorgeous and offered great gameplay that could back its strong aesthetics up. To this very day, Soul Calibur remains one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, standing alongside the likes of Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time and Final Fantasy VII. That's some impressive company. In fact, the game still looks graphically decent today, further illustrating the insanity that was the Dreamcast. Since we're on the subject of fighting games, the Dreamcast would be home to many classics, particularly those that featured beautiful, timeless 2D sprite work. Like the Saturn before it, the Dreamcast was excellent at delivering 2D games, capabilities that both the Nintendo 64 and the original Sony PlayStation was not very good at. For this reason, the Street Fighter 3 trilogy for a long time would be exclusively available in the home for the Dreamcast, with the titles containing far too many sprite animations for gameplay to be replicated on the competition's hardware. Another huge one would be Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which would offer up an incredibly huge roster of fighters, and more importantly, chaotic 3-on-3 combat featuring a balmy amount of Marvel and Capcom characters. The game really illustrates the Dreamcast's 2D capabilities, as the Sony PlayStation wasn't even capable of holding 4 characters in its working memory simultaneously to even allow for tag team matches in the first Marvel vs. Capcom game. But here is the Dreamcast, on the other hand, handling 6 with ease, thus providing further evidence of the huge generational leap. From JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Street Fighter 03, Rival Schools 2, and the Virtual Fighter games, the Dreamcast, like the Saturn before it, is another system packed to the brim with fighting game goodness. All this is obviously just scratching the surface, as there were so many amazing Dreamcast games. From Crazy Taxi to Virtual Tennis, Jet Set Radio to Space Channel 5. There is so much to love about the platform, beyond the colossal leaps it made through its graphical prowess. Oh, and did I mention the VMU memory units? Yeah, to be honest, retrospectively, they were mostly bloody pointless, but they seemed like a cool idea at the time. Primarily serving as memory cards, they offered additional features, such as displaying animations when we were playing games on the TV, and even offering some mini-games that could be played on the units themselves, all in all adding to the Dreamcast's quirkiness and desire to appear futuristic and grab gamers' attention. Reflecting on all of this, the Dreamcast may have been Sega's last ever mainline home console, but what an impressive effort it was, giving us memories that will last a lifetime. The Dreamcast was essentially the first console that offered games with 3D polygon visuals that genuinely looked good, rather than us having to suffer through more endearing blocky messes. For this reason, Dreamcast games have on the whole aged incredibly well in most instances, graphically still holding up now. From what I've witnessed in gaming, we have never once ever seen a graphical leap in line with what was as impressive with the Dreamcast. The platform offers a great library of visually pleasing games that, thanks to the system's 4 controller slots, presents opportunities for some fantastic couch co-op. And oh, did I mention that certain units have no copy protection, so you can play games burnt straight to disc if you please? Actually, I think I did, but I'll reiterate the point anyway. That is without even taking more modern methods into account of how you can take advantage of the Dreamcast's amazing library. All in all, it is an iconic system that every gamer should have in their collection. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe and check out my Sega Saturn deep dive right now. Cheerio!